Welcome to PIMCO Pod. In this episode, we discuss policy uncertainties that could shape the U.S. economy. Stay tuned after the conclusion of the podcast for additional important information. Key Policy Questions Likely to Linger After the Election by Tiffany Wilding and Libby Cantrill. Long after the U.S. election results are tallied, questions will linger around the likely economic impact of the next president's policy priorities. In some areas, the outlook is clearer. We can expect deficits to increase, the 2017 tax cuts to be mostly extended, U.S.-China tensions to continue, and the Federal Reserve to remain independent. That said, the practical details of fiscal and foreign policy will take months or more to unfold. Also, narrow congressional majorities will likely limit the scope for sweeping partisan change, potentially making some campaign rhetoric ring hollow. Not just policy priorities, but the implementation of those priorities, including the right personnel to drive them forward, will be critical in the months ahead. Here are 3 key policy uncertainties that could have a significant impact on the U.S. economy, regardless of who's in the White House. Deficit and debt. We've argued that the longer-term deficit is going to remain on an unsustainable path no matter who wins, so questions and concerns about the fiscal trajectory won't diminish. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, forecasts the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio could climb above 200% over the next several decades, largely due to the combination of an aging population and the government safety net programs, including Social Security and Medicare, that neither side seems keen to address. Meanwhile, longer-term interest rates in the U.S., measured by the 5-year forward interest rate, which as of this writing was 4.5%, are getting very close to nominal GDP trends, 2% real growth and 2% to 2.5% average inflation, a threshold where debt levels can spiral. Economic theory indicates that government debt is sustainable only when the average effective interest rate on the debt, R, is less than average nominal growth rates, G. Fortunately, the U.S. government still has a lot of lower coupon outstanding debt, and the effective average nominal interest rate it pays, roughly 3%, is still lower than estimated nominal potential growth rates and market rates. However, if long-term market interest rates stay at the current level, effective interest rates could increase to concerning levels over the next decade, or sooner if rates rise further from here, with higher trend growth rates. Taxes. Against these big questions around the longer-term debt outlook, tax policy legislation will be in focus in 2025, when many of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, provisions will expire. The net outcome of the extensions and pay-fors can only become clearer as we move through 2025. The CBO estimates the 10-year cost of the TCJA provisions, if made permanent, at around $4.5 trillion. We expect many of the provisions will be extended. Although the details are still murky, there are likely to be at least some pay-fors, perhaps corporate tax rate increases or tariff revenues, that will create sector and income level winners and losers. Furthermore, these tax changes aren't happening in a vacuum. The broader economic environment has historically influenced fiscal policy decisions. The extent to which a strong economy can garner higher pay-fors is a big question mark this legislative cycle. Trade. With broad-based agreement across the political spectrum that China's trade practices are detrimental to the U.S., but with widely different views by party on how to address the issue, trade uncertainty is also likely here to stay. Many Republicans are advocating broader and more aggressive trade policy proposals than President Joe Biden's small yard, high fence approach. Such proposals, if fully implemented, could be globally disruptive, with potentially large implications for currencies. But how much of this rhetoric is simply a negotiating tactic to gain leverage for a more reciprocal trade versus a genuine preference for outright decoupling? Democrats have focused on building a global coalition against Chinese trade practices, which is also likely to alter global trade patterns. How these policies interact with policies in other economies is another key question. Large swings in the U.S. dollar could have meaningful implications for emerging markets and for monetary policy. China's own domestic policy priorities will also be important. Weakness in the Chinese economy, stemming from the ongoing property sector contraction and weaker consumption, has recently spurred a barrage of monetary policy announcements seeking to stabilize output. Many analysts also expect to see more stimulative fiscal policies as well, given the lessons from Japan in the 1990s and the U.S. after the 2007 housing bubble burst. During periods of deleveraging, the efficacy of monetary policy has tended to decline. However, the extent and timing of China's policies will likely depend on how U.S. trade policy evolves, creating an environment where U.S.-driven disruption to the global trade order spurs counteracting stimulative measures elsewhere. Interestingly, China isn't the only country with potentially looser fiscal policy. Recent developments in the UK and Japan have also moved in that direction. Navigating uncertainties. Overall, post-election policies are likely to present economic tailwinds and headwinds. Tax cuts and extensions could support near-term growth, but the deficit is the loser regardless of the election outcome, raising more questions about the U.S.'s longer-term fiscal sustainability. U.S. trade policies to combat what the U.S. perceives as unfair practices have the potential to alter global activity and potentially usher in a wave of additional policy support from other governments. Over time, as today's policy uncertainties gradually shift into probabilities and then into realities, which may raise new questions, the U.S. and global economic outlook could shift notably through 2025 and beyond. Meanwhile, elevated uncertainty around future policy continues to affect decision-makers today, from the Federal Reserve to businesses to communities and families. Thank you for listening. That was key policy questions likely to linger after the election. For future insights, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Unless explicitly stated, views expressed do not constitute official PIMCO views. The discussion and content provided within this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and may not be appropriate for all investors. Reliance upon information provided in a podcast is at the sole responsibility of the listener. The information included herein is not based on any particularized financial situation or need and is not intended to be, and should not be construed as a forecast, research, investment advice, or a recommendation for any specific PIMCO or other security, strategy, product, or service. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Investors should speak to their financial advisors regarding the investment mix that may be right for them based on their financial situation and investment objective. Podcasts may involve discussions with non-PIMCO personnel, and such content contain the current opinions of the speaker, but not necessarily those of PIMCO. Other podcasts may consist of audio recording of an existing PIMCO article, and such material contains the current opinions of the manager. The opinions expressed in all podcasts are subject to change without notice. Information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable but not guaranteed. PIMCO, as a general matter, provides services to qualified institutions, financial intermediaries, and institutional investors. This is not an offer to any person in any jurisdiction where unlawful or unauthorized. For additional important information, go to www.pimco.com/gbl/en/general/legal-pages/podcast-disclosures.